Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. We have a great show for you today. Thank you for joining me. I discovered my next guest, Lyell Asher, through a wonderful video series on Peter Boghossian's YouTube channel. In 17 short videos, which I highly recommend, he explains why colleges are becoming cults. Professor Asher is an associate professor of English at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. He joined the department in 1994 and received his PhD from the University of Virginia in 1990. At Lewis and Clark, he offers courses in Shakespeare's early works, later works, ideas of the Renaissance and modernity, Renaissance literature, the art of the novel, major periods and issues, Montaigne and the life of the essay, the novel, and moral reflection. And I really can't recommend these videos enough. The 17 videos each are short. Each is short. You can go through them one after the other. And if you are concerned about what's going on in our colleges, I can't recommend it highly enough. So he's here today to discuss how the toxic ideologies that gained their sort of momentum and strength in America's colleges and universities are making their way, have made their way into the ed schools and are making their way down into K-12. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Lyell Asher. Good afternoon, Lyell. How are you today?
I'm great, Deb. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk to us about what's going on in school. So
Good
grateful.
to be here.
Great. So let's dive straight in. I was talking up your video series on Peter's YouTube. Highly recommend that everybody go see it. I know it says 17 videos, but they're short, guys. You got to do it. It's like one full-length video of mine. So you've said that ed schools, that concerns me greatly because of K-12, ed schools are the basket cases of American education. Explain, please.
Well, I should probably tell your listeners they don't need to take my word for it because I didn't just come up with this on my own. Maybe at some point today we can talk about the strange path that got me into this subject. But this is something that the people who've studied this, and I'm talking here about insiders, people who, like Arthur Levine, who was president for close to a decade of Teachers College in New York, which is the most prominent education school in the nation. He released a study in 2004 that he undertook with, I think, around 20 other people, not just ed school people, but because he wanted to make this a serious study. And so he invited not only educators from ed schools, but professors, journalists, serious journalists who are interested in this issue, and they together looked at the three primary divisions of ed schools: the way they train teachers, the way they train researchers, and the way they train administrators. So one thing people can do before I say anything myself about it is to go online and look up edschools.org. And you can download the report all in PDF files. There are executive summaries of each section, and then just read it for yourself. I heard about this report and knew something about it, but I made the mistake of not going to the report itself and reading it word for word. Since that time, I've probably read it 3 different times. And as I say in the video, it's the most devastating and depressing thing I have ever read. Even more depressing is the fact that after it was released, nothing was done. Nothing was done to remedy the problems that Levine himself, again, who is an insider, he has every reason to point to the good things that ed schools are doing. And, you know, it's not they don't get a 0, but it's a failing grade, no question about it. And so when I read that, this sent me on another path. I was saying, how did this come about? And I began looking sort of through the history of the literature, looking in vain for a defense of what was happening at ed schools. And honestly, I couldn't find it. When I wrote an essay in 2018 for the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the kind of the premier academic journal for education itself in higher ed. And my editor at the time, we were working on this long essay that became the kind of cover story for the Chronicle Ed Review called How Ed Schools Became a Menace. And like a good editor, he said, at one point you say that there are no defenses of ed schools. You go, surely there's at least one or two. And I said to him, well, I've looked in vain. I cannot find them. And I just, showed him. I said, maybe you can find it. I've been unable to find one. So there's that report. There's David Labari, who's an education professor at Stanford. He's a great historian of education. He wrote a book, I think, in 2004 called The Trouble with Ed Schools. And his only defense of ed schools is that they are more powerless than someone like E.D. Hirsch imagined. He said, and basically the idea is thank God they don't have any power, because if they did, they would wreck the schools. But, that's not true. They have an enormous amount of power. Yes.
I'm sitting here assuming that the audience knows what ed schools do.
Yes. Okay.
So I mean, it seems like before we go too far down the path, we probably should do a quick explanation of who attends ed schools, what they purport to do there, et cetera.
That's right. So it's a complicated subject, but we can kind of, narrow it down and simplify it. There are somewhere between 1,500 and 1,700 quote unquote ed schools in the United States right now. And it depends on how you define them. Ed schools is just a broad and somewhat fuzzy category for three different kinds of institution. One would be, you can call an ed school a department in a college or university that doesn't have a grad school. So people can graduate with a BA in education, right? In some states, that is enough to get them sort of a teaching certificate that will allow them to teach in public high schools and grade schools, elementary schools. And again, remember, most of the education policy in the United States is determined by the state. The federal government has very little control, in fact, outside the Department of Education about what states do. So there's the undergraduate level of ed schools. And then there are graduate programs in education. And most every state university in the United States will have an education school. Not all of them, but most of them will. Also, small colleges sometimes have an ed school. We, for example, here at Lewis and Clark have a school of education known as the Graduate School. And then there are the standalone ed schools. Teachers College used to be directly connected to Columbia, but that relationship has been severed. So they're an example of a kind of standalone school of education. Stanford has an ed school that's directly connected to Stanford. So these are the institutions that, for the most part, everyone will have to go through if they want to become a public school teacher, or in some cases, even a private school teacher. Some private schools only require a BA in a subject area, or a BA and a master's is sometimes preferable. And occasionally, if you get a very, very fine private school, you'll have people with doctorates. Not that means, by the way, having a doctorate doesn't necessarily mean you're a great teacher, but it suggests you might know something about the subject. So that's what we mean by ed schools. Now, one thing that's important to point out is that, sometimes people blame the teachers too much. Many of the teachers I've spoken to look back on their ed school training as being not only a waste of time, but an extraordinary expense, and they're still paying off the debt that they accrued during those years. So, one danger in all of this is to blame the teachers. Teachers are in a terrible spot, truth be told, most of them, in the sense that they are not given the tools they need very often by the ed schools to go in and teach the classes. I'll give you one example. I had a student many years ago who recently got in touch with me because she'd seen some of the things I'd written about ed schools. and said, boy, I can't agree with you enough. She got out of teaching precisely because she realized, even though she has her teaching degree, they didn't really talk about the most basic aspects of teaching, and they didn't even talk about setting up a curriculum. So you're thrown into these schools, no idea about what students, say, have learned in the third grade, for sure, if you're a fourth grade teacher. No idea how to set up a classroom necessarily. No idea how to deal with discipline problems if they occur. So the practical aspects of teaching have just been, for the most part, ignored. Now, here's another thing I need to say. This is not true of all education schools. There are schools that are bucking the trend and who actually do a great job of teaching and training teachers. How you find those, I'm not quite sure, but there's a website that I refer to in the video called the National NTCQ, the National Council on Teacher Quality,
Okay.
and that's something, if people out there are thinking about going into education, we need good teachers, so I hope some do. That's a place to look, the National Council on Teacher Quality. They are really on the front lines of evaluating schools of education, giving them letter grades according to a certain set of criteria. And it tells, incoming students, aspiring teachers, what they can expect to get from these schools. So some ed schools, for example, do a great job on teaching reading, but they are the minority right now. Most of them don't. Right. So that's something that everybody can do. So anyway, that's what ed schools are. And for those in your audience who are interested in teaching, there are places you can go to find out where the good ed schools are.
I did get my undergraduate in a completely different subject from Colby College. I got a degree in American Studies, but then I went to University of Pennsylvania for my master's, which was also a certification program. And what you're saying is true in the sense that, one part of it was excellent. I got to student teach for an entire year.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of places you get 7 weeks or something. So that was great. A lot of hands-on experience. On the flip side of that, a lot of it was theory. I didn't get any, I wouldn't say any, I got some instructional design, but very, very little. Did have child development, but not enough.
Sure.
And if I'm thinking about what I would have expected from a master's level program, I didn't feel it. It felt like I just went and got another bachelor's degree is what it felt like to me.
Yeah. Well, I get that from a lot of students I've talked to who've wanted to go into teaching. And, the fact is, experience in a classroom, that's really important. And also working with an experienced teacher.
Yes.
One of the things that ed school folks say about people like me is, well, you've never been trained to teach. Technically, that's true, but, maybe I've had more experience than other people did in graduate school. But at the University of Virginia, by the time you left that place with a PhD, in my case, for example, I taught probably 20 sections of writing by myself. I taught in the business school. I taught writing in the business school. I'd been a section leader for probably 5 or 6 courses. So I had a huge amount of teaching experience. That alone, of course, doesn't mean you're a good teacher. But you apprentice, a lot of your time in graduate school. So that's really, really, really crucial. But there are also very practical things that only an experienced teacher can help someone with, especially when you're dealing with, people who are, which unless you've had a younger sibling, you know nothing about. So, the worst thing is these public school teachers are in the trenches. And they are doing the Lord's work, and they need more help. So that's something I want to get across. This is not a war on teachers. On the contrary, I think we need to do much more to help them teach.
Right. Those who are willing to be helped, because I have seen a contingent who don't want to hear that anything they're doing is even subpar. Even
Absolutely.
if you were to wrap it up in all kinds of disclaimers, like, we know it's not your fault and you were taught this way and you weren't, you were indoctrinated. Like, it doesn't matter what you say. There's a defensiveness there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is in some ways it's nothing new. It's just gotten worse, and it's been going on for a long time. And I think one of the reasons, obviously, it's coming up now in the last couple of years is because, and this is a common bit of knowledge, the pandemic has brought all this into people's homes, and they've been able
Right.
to see for themselves what's often going on in our public schools.
Right. And as bad as the ideologies are, what I have seen are people who are simply not qualified to
Yeah,
teach anything. So, in
yeah,
other words, even if they're politically neutral, they are not only not teaching grammar, they're not equipped to teach grammar. Their own grammar is terrible. Their own spelling is terrible. They can't write.
yes,
They're not very good at math. So, they're not very
yeah,
good at teaching math because if you really can't teach something you don't deeply understand. In fact, that's one of the signs that you really understand something is you can teach it to somebody else. So,
yes,
we focus so much on the toxic ideologies, and I know we're going to in the show, but
yeah,
when your time and your brain space is taken up with that, what's not getting done? Well, what's not
absolutely, yeah,
getting done is becoming any kind of proficient in the subject matter.
yeah. No, that's true. The United States is unique in this regard, at least compared to, say, a place like Japan. Now, Japan is a smaller country. We can't expect the United States to imitate them. But Canada's, relatively close. Again, much smaller. I think 1/5 the size, if I'm not mistaken, of the United States. But,
California's bigger.
yeah, they take their teachers from, the top 20% of
Right.
people who graduate from college. And at least through K through 8, we take our teachers from the bottom 50%. Um, there are a lot of historical forces at work that have that have allowed that. I mean, it's not as if ed schools want necessarily to take people from that uh, group, and it doesn't mean, by the way, if you're in the bottom 50%, you're a horrible teacher. But it certainly doesn't recommend your program if you are drawing from the least academically inclined to teach something that's academics. That seems fairly obvious. Um, and one of the things that I can't remember, Kate Walsh pointed out in a interview I heard with, I can't remember the name of the podcast, but she, said it's really crucial to understand that academics are very important. Basically, mirroring what you said, that if we don't have teachers who are academically inclined themselves, we can't expect them to uh, teach subjects even to sixth graders. I mean, as you say, it really takes knowing something really well in order to reduce it and simplify it in a way that students can understand. But the biggest problem, right, quite apart from what an individual teacher does or the individual instruction the teacher gets, is that the United States doesn't have, even on a state level for the most part, specific guidelines in K through 12 education about what should be taught. Now, in science and math, this has changed a little bit, right? Because after all, it's an easier subject, it's an easier thing to deal with. But what should be the standards for, say, a third grader in let's say Oregon or North Carolina? What should they know? School districts and states have shied away from actually being specific about content knowledge. This is a point that, and I'd recommend all your listeners read apart from Arthur Levine's 3-part study on ed schools published in 2004, I'd really recommend another book, The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them by E.D. Hirsch.
E.D.
And that
Hirsch,
book
I was
was
about to
published
say.
in 96. E.D. Hirsch was way ahead of us in all this, as was Diane Ravitch. They're now sort of on different sides of the scholastic political spectrum. They're both liberals. That is to say, on the progressive side, both of them are on that side, although Hirsch very often gets sort of castigated as and labeled as a conservative. He's not. But that book really explains very well the schools we need and why we don't have them. That very issue. Why is it that we don't have a coherent set of guidelines in the United States for what a third grader should know, what a fourth grader should know.
Right.
So that,
Well, there's a
and without
difference.
that, you can't expect a teacher to come in and build on knowledge or expectations, given that they have no clue for the most part, nothing specific. They have general statements about what they may have learned. But on the humanities side, whether it's English literature, whether it's history, all those things require content knowledge. That is real
Yes.
content. Do you know what we mean when we say Europe? Do you know what we mean when we
Right.
say South Africa? Now, this seems funny because, and this is another point that Hirsch has been making in all of his books. There's not a bad book in the bunch. I've read them all, some of them several times. He's still writing at the age of 92 or 3, I think, right now. He's like Thomas Sowell, by the way, who I'd also recommend on his book on charter schools. But Hirsch points this out, and I make this point in the video, just basically borrowing from Hirsch, that it's the advantaged families. They don't realize how advantaged they are. That is, they don't realize that over the course of 3 or 4 years in their child's life, their child may hear 45 million words spoken. In an impoverished family, let's say, and this includes all races, those children may only hear 15 million words. And we know that because of a study done by Todd Risley and his co-author. And so it just proceeds from there. The knowledge that children get around the dinner table, going to museums, listening to their friends talk. I mean, my daughter, she comes from a very privileged household in some respects. There are thousands of books in the house, thousands of books in this office. She was up here with my friends and colleagues. She listened to us talk probably way too much. So she got an education. And even if you don't have parents who are professors, you don't realize just how much children pick up. So that when she asked, wait a minute, what do you mean by South Africa? Well, we're talking about a country. Or we're talking about a country within Africa. What about North Africa? Well, North Africa is a region of Africa. Now, this is a trivial example. But just imagine that you're listening to someone talk, and say you're in the 7th grade and somebody refers to South Africa, and you don't know that that's a country. And then they begin talking about Northern Africa, and you're talking about that's a region. There's so much noise that's created when you're trying to figure out what this sentence means just by the fact that you don't know these references.
Right.
Hirsch's argument in all of his books has been, if schools aren't giving students this kind of basic concrete knowledge, what words mean, what we are referring to when we're talking, then basically you are increasing the inequities. You're increasing the disparities in knowledge between the poor and the rich. So as I say in the video, if you don't have that, if you don't have serious content knowledge that advantaged children are getting at home, all your talk about social justice and racial equity, it's just talk. And Hirsch makes this point in all of his books. I think the latest one is How to Educate a Citizen, I think published in 2019, if I'm not mistaken. Fantastic book.
I've read it.
And in some way, that's the book maybe to start with, because it's a summary in some ways of everything he's been saying all these years.
Yeah, we need to have a common knowledge. I think part of the problem is that people confuse the term standards with guidelines on what to teach. And so when Common Core came out and claimed to be standards, people assumed it was standards as far as what the child will know, and it's not. It's standards and what will be covered. The problem is you can cover it any number of a million different ways. It could be, look, I covered it, all the way to an in-depth study of it. So we don't have anything that tells like a rubric that tells the teacher, when the student completes your class or your grade, they better know these things, because they're now going to go to the next grade where they're going to need to learn these additional things. And even in math, that's the case. So you've got students coming in where, yes, they were presented with multiplication, but it was like, look, I did it. I presented multiplication, but whether the child learned it or not is a whole separate issue. So the teachers were left kind of high and dry with, well, how do I present that? how do I teach that so they will learn it? That's the part that's not getting done. And parents are absolutely oblivious to this. They don't know. They assume a standard means a standard. Like, their child's going to be held to perform or just demonstrate that they know it. And that is not the case. And now, of course, we see movements because of equity and so forth to lower any rubrics we might have had, like end of grade tests. Like, we need to lower those because, of course, the results are poor.
Yeah.
We don't have standards.
That's right. Well, one of the other things I went out in the video is that, it would be one thing if we didn't have schools that are doing this, that are accomplishing this. Not in wealthy districts. Anybody can do it there. What about poor districts in, say, Brooklyn, for example, the South Bronx? Well, we have schools that do it. And we have schools that accomplish great things in minority neighborhoods and impoverished neighborhoods. And so, as I mentioned, you'd think that people would say, oh my gosh, we're actually doing things here. How do they do it? Let's run and find out what actually works. But they don't do that. This is where I'll recommend some more books. I hope I'm not giving your audience too much.
Hope you guys are
material.
readers. No, it's great. It's great.
Karen Chenoweth, who, again, I found just in this quest that I have been on for the last 6 or 7 years. I discovered Karen Chenoweth's books. The first one I came across was It's Being Done, 2007. And it's a remarkable book because what she does is she and her team have a set of criteria. They want to find out if there are schools that are in districts that are not particularly wealthy. In fact, they want to have a high minority population. They want to have a sort of high impoverished population, and are in a wide range of settings, inner cities, some out in the country, and yet manage to educate students in such a way that they do really well on their tests.
Right.
And so that was the criteria. And she goes out and finds, I think, 15 or 20 schools. And then she goes around and studies each one with her team, and they find out what works. Right. Well, it's a wonderful read. It's very inspiring. And you get to the end of the book and you have a list of, I think there may be 7 or 8, 9 things that all these schools do, all of them agree on, all that they have in common. Now, the schools not only vary in size and geographical location, they also differ in some ways in the way they accomplish these goals, but they're all doing it. And
so we know, and we do know what works. I mean, I've been saying this to people on the channel for 2 years now. It's not unknown to us. We put a man on the moon, that's my go-to example, but we have known for a long time what works in terms of reading instruction, math instruction. And then people do throw in the, what about minorities? And I always look at them like, so what are you saying? It's like Frederick Douglass taught himself. I mean, we know what works. What you're talking about is not the how to teach. What you're talking about is how to teach 30 kids at a time in a building, in a neighborhood with outside influences and so forth. That's a different conversation, but unfortunately they've gotten conflated. And this is what I want to talk about next with regard to the teachers coming out of university. We've conflated the societal ills that plague them when they leave the school, okay, with what needs to be done in the classroom to teach them, as though they're completely inseparable. And if we don't modify what we do inside the classroom, we're somehow carrying that stuff from outside in and whatever. I mean, when that has never been the case. If you read Thomas Sowell's biographies about his upbringing and where he went to school, it's like you close the school door and Harlem's out there. There wasn't this like, oh, you're poor and you live with your aunt and you're coming in the classroom and, oh, are you okay, Thomas? That just wasn't even happening.
Yeah. Well, Sowell, I can hear, our critics say, Sowell is an unusual case, to be sure. What I mean is, not everybody can do that. But, and here's where I agree with you, and I do agree with you. I just want to disarm our critics for a little bit by admitting that there are people that are extraordinary. But nevertheless, what worked for Thomas Sowell in that school, maybe they didn't all go to the Hoover Institution but it helped everyone. It gave everyone an opportunity, the same opportunity that Sowell had. I had a student, oh my gosh, probably 25 years ago when I first arrived at Lewis and Clark. I won't mention his name, but anybody who was there at the time knows who I'm talking about. And because this is public knowledge, I'm not giving away any prized or private information. He was a black student who saw his mother killed in Los Angeles. He retreated to the local library and taught himself. To this day, he's one of the most remarkable students I've ever had. So people can do it. There's no question. But the idea that somehow there's something other than giving students knowledge about the world, making sure that they have the things that advantaged students pick up at home, that they take for granted, making sure that if their parents, for whatever reason, are not able to supply them with the kind of environment that we would all want for our own children, the idea that we're going to change society first and then educate the child. I think you can change society best, at least for that student, by making sure that what the parents aren't doing, what their community isn't doing, we can help them do. We can give it to them. Exactly. And that's what that's what the American education system, going back to the 19th century, was founded on, for God's sakes. The idea was America was way out in front, in deciding that everyone deserves an education. And the premise of that and the promise of that was that regardless of your background, you should have a right to an education. And so all we really need to do is, try to fulfill that promise. By giving students the tools they need to succeed. But of course, if you think that succeeding in a country that is, defined by sort of patriarchal, racist oppression, then the idea of succeeding in this country is not really the goal for a lot of the educational theorists that we have. So if you tell them maybe these students aren't succeeding, they'll say, yes, that's the point. Because why would we want them to succeed? I know this sounds crazy to people, but all you have to do is read what they say. And unfortunately, many people in the ed schools, especially the most prominent ones, this is a case in which the sort of more prominent ed school you go to, the less likely you are to get anything that will be helpful to young people. The best ed schools are way out in the middle of the country, probably on this score.
Right.
But there's a serious problem when you have a number of educational theorists, and this is something also I mentioned in the video, where another group, a couple of researchers wrote an essay about looking at syllabi in ed schools. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they found was that in the 20 top ed schools, the vast majority of them were teaching their aspiring teachers to be suspicious of knowledge. Yes. To be suspicious of knowledge. Because knowledge, all it does, how they understand this is that knowledge is really the building blocks that sustain a corrupt society. So why would you give people the tools to sustain this?
But only people who had been poorly educated to begin with could fall for that. Yes. I know it's anecdotal. I use a lot of anecdotes, but that's kind of what I've got at my disposal. But I was very fortunate to have had an excellent, at least 3 years of high school. I went away to boarding school after public school. Yeah. And it was such a sea change in terms of depth of content and everything. And I loved it. And I especially loved history and literature, which is why I couldn't choose between English and history. So I did American studies. But then when I went to ed school and I would hear things, or they'd give me Paulo Freire to read, or they'd give me things like that, I was immediately recoiling because I couldn't fathom anyone suggesting that a child, whether they be in Harlem or West Philadelphia or the South Side of Chicago or whatever, didn't have or shouldn't have as much access to the knowledge that I had access to, that made me who I was, that helped me see the world as full of possibility and build all kinds of skills and, all the things that knowledge can do, opening doors, at least in your mind, if not in reality. And it seemed the opposite of what they were saying. It seemed like you're going to consign these kids to permanent serfdom if you tell them to be suspicious of the things that we know. And as I said, if you know history and you know about the Middle Ages and you know about times in history and other cultures where they weren't allowed to have knowledge, okay, when a tiny little subset of people were allowed to have it,
Yes.
and what that consigned them to in terms of poverty, you would never fall for that. You would just be like, this is ridiculous. And
Yes.
that's what I felt like. I was looking around the classroom waiting for other people's faces to be like all screwed up like mine. And other students were like, tell us more. And I'm thinking, I've just gone through a wormhole and I'm on another planet. What is going on here?
Well, another book I recommend, you talk about anecdotal. We can look at a survey that's not anecdotal at all. It's by Rita Kramer, called Ed School Follies, published in the early 90s. She, sort of went around the country. She's a brilliant writer. She writes on a lot of things and still alive. I, in fact, was in contact with her 2 or 3 years ago, and just by email. But she went around the country trying to figure out why kids weren't learning very much. And so she started visiting ed schools. Now, when I say visiting, she went there, talked to students, talked to faculty, sat in on classes. And I don't know how long she spent, but, let's say several days at each place. And it's a remarkable book because there are good things that she discovers, but mostly it's and that predates Arthur Levine by about a decade or more. But even better than our Arthur Levine study, which tends to be somewhat abstract. He doesn't talk about what actually happens in a classroom, though he has lots of studies and surveys that discover that. She actually tells you, sort of records conversations. And you get to see what happens at Teachers College, what happens, I think, at Stanford and other places. And again, this was the book that, sort of confirms what other people have shown, that the more prestigious the ed school is, the more likely they are to be captured by ideology, which is the enemy of educating children, not the friend, and especially the enemy of educating the least advantaged students and minority students too.
Yep, so true. Penn was like that. Here, read Paulo Freire. They told us teaching is a political act.
Yeah.
That's what they said, and that we were liberating our students. And so I hear, and initially I hear that, it falls in my ears, and I'm thinking, of course, education is going to liberate you. Well, of course it is, because I'm thinking knowledge. I'm thinking of, like to teach a slave to read is to make him unfit to be a slave, right? To teach him to read. That's Frederick Douglass.
Yes.
So I'm thinking, of course it's liberating. And then they tell me, like, no, not knowledge. Teach him how oppressed he is. Make him angry, get him fired up. All the vocabulary he should learn should be about oppression and poverty and darkness and and those are the words we're going to work on in first grade. I'm sorry, what? So yeah, it didn't fit in.
Well, and that's one of the things that happens, and it's why, several of my students who made the ed school try ended up either dropping out of ed school, or they dropped out after they started teaching because they realized it wasn't for them. And in 3 of the cases I'm thinking of, this was a real shame because we lost very smart, very dedicated young people who I know would have been great teachers. But it was really the ed school training, and in some cases the lack of ed school training they got, that turned them off.
Right, for sure. So the ideologies themselves, they've worked into the colleges. Maybe you can explain a little bit about how that works, because what I noticed in the videos is you explain in detail how the administration is as guilty, if not more so, than the professors in the departments. And it's not just the academic side, it's the administrative side. And what a lot of people ask me is, but why? Now,
Yeah.
you mentioned that the administrators are poorly educated, just like the teachers are poorly, ed school teachers are poorly educated, and that there's some of the worst educated. But what's their incentive, though? I understand if you're not well educated, but I just don't get how it's been so pervasive.
Okay, so this is very interesting because this is a relatively recent discovery of mine. And so I'm thinking here about your audience. If they went to college in the 70s, 80s, 90s, most of their encounter, even in the early 2000s, most of their encounters with college administrators was, fairly benign. Administrator was the RA in your dormitory, maybe the, dean of students, person who, if you were a work study student, you had to interview, all that. So that's completely different. So when you talk about college administrators, many times audiences who are, let's say, over 35 have no idea what you're talking about. You say, what are you talking about? College administrators? You mean the president, provost? No, something happened, and it's really started in the late 90s, but it blossomed in the mid 2000s. And this was sort of if I added anything original to this whole conversation, it was this sort of discovery, which was that not only were we getting sort of this huge influx on college campuses of administrators, and I'm not talking here about provosts, academic deans, deans of students necessarily, but the people who now work in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, student engagement, sustainability, all this, the things that just weren't there. And these all have great sounding names, and they, if they did what they said they would do, who could oppose them, right? So again, one is at a rhetorical disadvantage when talking about, when complaining about diversity, equity, inclusion. Who could be against that? But what happened was, and this, again, happened in the mid 2000s and is now in full bloom, is that administrators were being trained, and this was something entirely new. They were being trained and credentialed by the same institutions that were training K through 12 teachers. You say, well, what happened before? Well, for the most part, first of all, there weren't that many administrators in colleges and universities in proportion to professors. That's the first thing that happened. And the second thing is we didn't have all these bureaucratic administrative positions. And the worst possible thing happened. Remember, one of the crazy things about the United States is it's a kind of schizophrenic society when it comes to education. On the one hand, we have all these fantastic colleges and universities. We have colleges and universities, not all of them, but many of them that are the envy of the world. And then we have a K through 12 education system that is not the envy of the world. On the contrary, people will take their kids, if they're coming here as foreign visitors, they will take their kids and send them to Europe or someplace rather than send them to. So the question is, how do we explain this? This is, again, where Edie Hirsch comes in. I think there's a section called, Why Do We Have Such Great Colleges and Such Bad K through 12 Schools, right? So at least there was this kind of moat. And I experienced that firsthand. I wasn't the best, high school student myself and wasn't all that interested in education for any number of reasons. But when I went to college, my life was transformed. Like you going to this boarding school, I think you mentioned, it was an entirely different world. So that we had this moat that sort of separated the K through 12 and college universities for years. And that was a good thing to the extent that, at least if you made it to college, you might get an education that you didn't get K through 12. Well, so that moat was crossed. It was bridged. And this is the major thing that's happened to universities. And it was the subject of that essay I wrote called How Ed Schools Became a Menace, if anybody wants to read that. It's behind a paywall at the Chronicle, but it was also republished in Quillette. You can get it for free, where I go into detail about this. But basically, the worst of all possible things happened. We took the people who are most responsible for decimating our K through 12 system and keeping the way it is. And then, of all things, put them in the one place where we had education actually working, in colleges and universities. And so that's really, in some ways, where it started. Now, I can't pretend that
Come on into the China shop, Mr. Bull. Come on.
Yes.
Come on in.
Just think about this. Just imagine if, in the 1970s and 80s, instead of the Japanese coming in and basically showing American car makers how cars should be made, we sent Ford and Chevy engineers to Japan. That's basically what we did. We said, let's take the managerial class that's being certified, credentialed by these, failing institutions, and put them into leadership positions in America's colleges and universities. Now, why didn't anybody stop it? As I mentioned in the last section of this why colleges are becoming cults, I was sort of on ground zero. I was right here. And what I noticed was we had this influx of administrators. You began hearing things like, we're all educators. We'd hear this on emails, we're all educators. And none of us knew what that meant. We were just teaching, okay, sure, we're all educators. And in retrospect, I realized what this was. It was a kind of attempt to sort of sideline faculty, or at least demote them, so that we could now bring in people from, most of the time, credentialed with ed school degrees, so that they could, quote unquote, be teachers too. So they could disallow them to teach basically sort of classes in the dormitories, orientation sessions, which sometimes last an entire semester. Sometimes, they don't meet every week. They sometimes just meet twice a month. But this allowed them to, quote unquote, educate students. And in every case that I'm aware of, it's basically been indoctrination. And, the best example of this, of course, the horror story is the University of Delaware, which I talk about. But if anybody wants to go find out what actually happened at Delaware, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, really broke the story about what was happening at Delaware. And that sort of has, set the ball rolling. That what happened at University of Delaware, because it didn't stop there, even though it was embarrassing, and the president had to finally close that program down. It got such bad press, deservedly so. It couldn't get enough bad press if you actually look what these people were doing. But, the woman who headed that program, Kathleen Kerr, instead of being fired, she was promoted. She became a kind of hero among the academic administrators in colleges. In fact, became president of the Association for College Administrators, and has recently published a book. They love it because this gives them even more purchase in the sort of the teaching and indoctrination of students in higher education. So that's the real story here.
I have a theory. I call it revenge of the C students. But but what I mean is, we, looking at it historically, this country went through a major economic shift where, factories shut down, a lot of things went overseas, a lot of automation came into being. And people who, before, let's say 1980 or so, like before the mid 70s, they might have, if they weren't the brightest bulb in the shed, but they weren't skilled, like they weren't a carpenter or the mechanic or something like that, they might have gone into maybe the service industry, or they might have gone into some other kind of line of work in a factory. They could have even been an administrator in a factory, or done something purchasing or reception or whatever. And I feel like we suddenly ran short of jobs for those people that are kind of average. They sort of like phoned it in or didn't really do much in school, and they're not really academic and so forth. And being a school administrator, and also being a school teacher at the elementary level in particular, sorry guys, no offense, I wasn't an elementary teacher, but I'm just calling it like I see it, is a fast track to a decent paying white collar job with social status, where people even call you a hero just because of your title. Like you're a fireman and a first responder because you occupy a classroom. And it's a quick and easy way with some decent vacation time and benefits to get something that other people have had to work really, really hard to get. And then when you add the federally guaranteed student loans and all this money just pouring in, it's like, why not self-deal to yourself and your friends and get more of these positions to, hire more of these people. And I feel like it's just like the schools to a certain extent have become a jobs program for overflow of, school counselors and social workers and all kinds of these support staff, not first tier instructors, mind you, but all these other people. And we're just bloating administration in K-12. Then same with college. And it's like a FDR make work program at this point. The only problem is they're not just taking up space and getting paid. They're changing the ideology and the direction and the quality of these institutions dramatically.
Yeah, no, that's true. Hirsch gives a version of that in the book I've mentioned 4 or 5 times now. That is to say, there's a fair amount of resentment involved, against the, professorial class by administrators. That's one thing he says. It seems true. There's another book I'll recommend to your audience as well. This is from a slightly different place by a guy named Michael Lind, Lind, called The New Class War. This is one of the best books I've ever come across that sort of helps you understand. I mean, you hear new class war, you think, oh, this is Marxist infused. No, not at all. He talks about the limitations of Marx, but he's trying to understand basically the point you're making. How do we understand what's happening, not only in terms of education, but also economics? Why do we have, because here's one of the problems that really puzzled me. I couldn't understand why it was that you had boards of trustees in American colleges and universities, most of whom come from a business class, right? So they tend to be somewhat conservative, at least more conservative than most faculty. But instead of blocking what was happening in this sort of administrative culture that at least identifies itself as left-wing, although it's only left-wing in a very strange way. Why they were encouraging this. Not only were they not stopping it, they were encouraging it. And so what I realized, and this is why, I use the word woke. People sometimes object to the word woke, but we need another word because left doesn't always work. Because, the distinction I make between people who are quote unquote woke and the left, let's say the traditional left, the old-fashioned left, is that whereas the old-fashioned left was focused primarily on economic disparities, that this unjust society is basically about economics, the wokeists have decided that the injustice has primarily to do with race and gender as opposed to class. Now, you realize, of course, why this is this is fine with the business class. This is fine with the moguls because it's no threat whatsoever to the immiseration of the middle class and the poor. Right. So it keeps us divided. And, I don't know if you've read the book by Vivek Ramaswamy called Woke Inc. So if you read...
I haven't read it, but
I've fantastic, because he's really putting meat on the bones that Michael Lind gives you in that book, The New Class War. This was the great mystery when I was writing that essay, how ed schools became a menace. This is the part I got to this one part I could not figure out this contradiction. And then I began, reading around a bit. I don't think I'd read Michael Lind at that point, but I had read Noam Chomsky of all people. Now this is a big surprise. Noam Chomsky is on this. he understands, like Glenn Greenwald. These are both, people of the left, but they understand this. So this is why the categories of left and right are, in some ways, not always useful. In fact, can be quite misleading. But right.
It's also why we can't just call them Marxists. Somebody's asking in the comments, why can't we just call them Marxists? Well, because their ideologies are Marxian, but they're also Marcusian, but they're also Hegelian, but they're also, it's a little mishmash. But because economically, the Marxists are critical of them. The actual communists, if you read what they write, and I've gone to some of their websites, they're angry because the working class is being trampled all over. And this is,
Yes.
as Glenn Greenwald talks about, it's a top-down ideological oppression. It's more aligned with fascism. It's actually a little
Absolutely.
more
Yes.
fascistic, because you've got these elites and the government and these big tech moguls and big business, and they're playing winners and picking winners and losers. And of course, there's the military industrial complex. It feels a whole lot more similar to fascist regimes than to the Stalinist, the Stalinist court. Okay, maybe. But in terms of economics, it's
Yes.
not Marxist.
That's right.
That's my take on it.
Yeah. James
It's
Lindsay's book.
Marxian, but that's it.
That's right. James Lindsay has a book called Race Marxism, which is sort of
Yes.
making this point. I don't know exactly what Lindsay believes about all these things, but and again, when we're talking about what people have in mind and what the motives are various. And a lot of these people who are in these positions, it's not as if they're dyed-in-the-wool Marxists. They haven't even read Marx. They have no idea who he is. Couldn't probably understand him if they did. But that doesn't mean they're not being sort of put in the service of some very large ideology. I think it's very clear that this is, this is helping the sort of immiseration of the middle class and the poor. It's not liberating them. And this is why, all the big companies are so much at ease. This was, again, the big mystery 4 years ago. It's becoming very clear that, this stuff sells. And as long as you can keep people divided, blacks against whites, against Hispanics, if you can always, just point to that conflict and even exacerbate it, then no one will pay attention to the fact that there's a very small group of people that are walking away with all the money. They're offshoring American jobs, and offshoring American jobs, affects everybody. It affects, especially it affects the minority communities. So, again, the book that really opened my eyes to another way of thinking about this was Michael Lynn's book, The New Class War. Oh, and there's a shorter introduction that he published just, I think, maybe a year later, that your readers can get. It's called The Double Horseshoe, Michael Lynn. You can just find that on the internet and read it. And he's trying to, and he completely changed my way of understanding economics and class. And it has, here and there, it has some connections with Marxism, but much more sophisticated and much smarter.
Right. Yeah, I just think what we're going through right now is so hard to just label it's this. Yeah. Right. That's why what James has done is so helpful, because he's kind of like pulling different things. And I wonder if it's sort of intentionally complex, or, in terms of the people who are really kind of pulling the strings at the tippy top. They have, a specific goal, and they know, a circular economy and globalist and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But as you just pointed out, in order to divide us, one of the most effective ways to just, here's a little Marxism, a little Marcuse, a little this, a little that, race Marxism, here's some gender stuff, here's the, oh, you want some religious revivalism, let's throw that in over there, and it's some white supremacy, let's toss that over there. So you almost can't help but feel like it's just, how many seeds of division can we just throw out there and see who bites? Because there isn't a unifying culture anymore. To your point, and Edie Hirsch's point in the book, How to Educate a Citizen, we have for so many decades not done that. We've left generations like hollow or free to just kind of, they should be free, but free of knowledge or any kind of grounding in a common thread of our culture to sort of depart from. There was nothing there. So that, you can easily be wooed over here or wooed over there. And so while we're busy forming our little tribes, where of course it's easy to conquer this little tribe and that little tribe, and that it's easy to control us, then the people who have got all their stuff together, they know who they are and what they want.
Yeah.
Can just, buy up all the farmland and take over the food production and take over the medical establishment and take over technology. And we'll wake up one day and go, what happened? What? That's, I know I sound crazy, but
No, not at all. And you notice this. You notice this in the threat that's posed by, for example, someone like I think her name is Mayra Flores, who just won that,
Yes,
150-year Democratic seat.
the new face
And I
of
heard,
white supremacy.
yeah, the new face of white. First, it was Larry Elder, who hilariously said, "This is the face of white supremacy," and now I think,
Right.
I mean, that shows you how desperate they are to keep the racial divisions going.
Yes.
Because the truth is, there's nobody I hate more than a racist, and everybody. And I'm a registered independent, and but I have many conservative friends. I have many of them that go way, way, way back. They don't care about race; they do care about ideas. And you will notice that conservatives will embrace someone like Mayra Flores, and it has zero to do with the color of her skin. In fact, I think they are very happy to have her in the party. And the great irony of all this, it may be, of course, this is what many people have said all along. The great strength of this country comes from immigrants.
Yes.
and the great irony may very well be that we will save American values by
I keep looking for
the
a
work
Spanish
of people who
translator for my
appreciate
videos.
it the most, who know what it's like not to have them. And someone like Mayra Flores, born in Mexico, may be the very person to do that. I mean, it's a little early to tell. I don't know what she may do, but I really enjoyed seeing that.
Yeah, I think, like I was just saying, I really would love to have a Spanish translator for my videos or something, because I just believe that there are a lot of people out there hard at work. They're busy every day. They send their kids to school. They have no idea what's going on. They thought better life, better schools. And if they knew, that would be it, that it would be over. Like they'd just be like, oh, no, this is not happening to my child. But I just don't think they know.
That's right.
I don't think they've
been they got a glimpse of it the last 2 years. And I think that's why a lot of this is happening. I think Mayra Flores probably wouldn't have won had it not been for the pandemic and sort of the televised classes that were going into her room.
That's true. And so we've covered, the administrators and their lack of, acumen and anything academic. And then they've gone into the colleges and kind of dumbed them down and made them more ideological. And then we have the ed schools filled with the same people and so on. So somebody asked in the comments, when did it become a requirement for teachers to have an ed school or administrators in colleges, for that matter, to have these ed school degrees? And do we have a chance of taking that back? In other words, defanging the ed schools to where we once again say, okay, we need administrators and we need teachers in the schools, but this institution is not delivering the goods. So we need a different way. Is that even possible?
It is possible, but it's like everything else, it involves politics. And it's always on the state level. So this is where, keep in mind, because these ed schools have deep connections with teachers' unions, who have lots of money, lots of power, lots of political influence. They've been at this for decades. And here's the other problem that is sort of behind what your reader is, or one of the listeners is getting to. The trouble with, this is that parents are only have their kids in schools very often for just, a few years. So they're really interested in this for a while. And then once their kid goes off to college, they're on other subjects. So there's this constant turnover. Meanwhile, the teachers' unions and the education schools, they're in it for the long haul. The fact is, if you read the Arthur Levine report, I've never read anything that is sort of that compiles a better case for getting rid of education schools entirely than that report. But even if you don't believe that, the fact that they didn't do anything in response to it tells you that it is not going to come through argumentation. It's not going to come through argument. It's going to have to be political. That is, you're going to have to say, if you don't do something about these education schools, you can forget my vote. Of course, the trouble is, too, I mentioned this in the video, if you go to your State Board of Education. Everybody can go to the website, look up who's on that board, and then go on LinkedIn and find out who these people are.
Right.
95% of them will have degrees in education.
Yeah.
So
right.
It's a closed shop. So it's going to take a lot of work. Massachusetts, I think back in the mid 2000s, basically took E.D. Hirsch's curriculum and worked it into the system, and in a few short years became basically transformed their public education. Mm-hmm. But of course, then that couldn't last because there were too many forces marshaled against it. So it's doable. It is doable, but it has to work on the state level. And there's never been a better time to do it than now.
Right. What do you, parents ask me all the time, with things this bad, do you advise against our kids going to college, or is there a specific process they should follow to search for college? We already understand now that if you want to go to ed school, for some reason, you should at least look at the edschools.org that I put up there in the pinned comment, and research your ed schools. But for those who want to go to college for other things, what's your advice? What's your best advice to them?
Well,
given everything that's going on.
Yeah, I don't just recommend people going to college. I couldn't do that, and not because I have some interest because I'm in a college.
Sure.
Not just that.
But you don't specifically recommend against it either.
Right? No, I don't recommend against it.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm not saying I don't want to make this anti-college because it transformed my life. The reason I'm so interested in this is precisely because I know the potential of college to do great things. And I don't mean to paint with such a broad brush. There are very fine schools out there who are doing great things, who are not completely woke. So this is one thing everybody needs to remember, that I think all the institutions that I know of, with certain exceptions like Hillsdale College or the new University of Austin,
right.
Most schools are on this road. The question is how far down the road they're on. How do you determine that? One thing you can do is go to the FIRE website, Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and they rank colleges according to their standing strong on questions of free speech and academic freedom. So that should be a website you should visit, I think.
Okay.
And then I think you could probably when you're at the college, you can find out what their orientation sessions are like. Who does the orientation sessions? What is the content?
Good point.
And ask to see, and this is really crucial because that will tell you a lot. Because if they're indoctrinating students at orientation sessions, guaranteed they're doing it through the rest of the college. So this just occurred to me. I hadn't been thinking about this, but ask to see the website for student orientation. And if it's political, if they are, as my college did 2 or 3 years ago, dividing students by race, that's a red flag. I would not go to that school. I would not send my child to that school. And unless something has changed, but you can ask these administrators, you can ask the provost, ask the presidents, saying, what happens in the dormitories? Are these
right?
Are the people who run the dormitories, are they also quote unquote teaching students things? The only people who should be teaching are students at college are professors. Now, of course, we're not out of the woods because there are there are professors who are sort of professing ideology, but generally students can find out who those professors are and avoid them. There are a lot of great professors out there who are not doing this. They may not speak up, but they're interested in education as you and I are.
Right. And FIRE would pick up if, for example, the professors, if people like you were required to, sign DEI statements, or because I know in the California system, they're starting to want that. And there are other systems that are making professors, like if you want to be in the tenure track, you have to sign an equity statement or a DEI statement. And to me, that's just chilling. That's like right up there with some kind of loyalty oath. That's horrible.
Yeah. Now, here's again where we have the mystery, because fire would only get a hold of it if someone objected. That is to say, this may be going on, but unless and I happen to know a case right now
Right.
where a professor is wondering whether he should contact fire because basically he's being evaluated according to his agreeing to what amounts to a loyalty oath. And this person is a progressive leftist, but he objects to the idea that he should, or that anybody else at a university should have to basically take a political litmus test. So it's not a foolproof method, but it helps to go on fire and see what they think. They have schools that are really good, and they can help you.
Now, are professors and teachers, to your knowledge, doing anything as a group to fight back? So, for example, are you aware of any universities where professors who've been, attacked by students or by the administrators are banding together, even if it's half a dozen people, to push back and say, we're united in this, and it's not just this poor lone Yale professor standing on the quad getting screamed at, or it's not just Eric Weinstein and his wife, standing there in the middle of the campus getting yelled at or getting threats. Have there been groups that have formed and said, we're all going to go or something if you don't do something about this?
Well, I wish I had better news on that front. But Christopher Hitchens once said somewhere, there is no more cowardly creature on God's green earth than a professor with tenure. And and I'm afraid
you would think they'd be more brave. They have tenure.
I know. No? It's one of the great revelations of my life to discover that. But there are some organizations. Heterodox Academy. That's an organization that appeared about, I think 5 or 6 years ago. Jonathan Haidt, who is a friend of Greg Lukianos, and they've written a book together, started that organization, and that's been very good. And there are other ones too. Foundation Against Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, which not specifically involves professors, but there are professors who have joined that. I think there are other ones, and but not as many as you would want. And people, even if they agree, they're very often just afraid to speak out. It's not as if tenure is, an insulation against being fired, of course, but it does provide more protection than 99.9% of all American workers have. So it's especially disappointing to see the people who have the power to speak up for individual rights and freedom of thought, freedom of expression in every direction are not doing so. And that's been the great disappointment, I think, of my life in the last decade.
Well, it seems to me they should know better than anyone what will happen to us as a society if we lose knowledge, because it feels to me as a parent and as a former teacher that reality itself is under assault. Knowledge itself is under assault. You mentioned earlier in this show that they're teaching future teachers to be suspect of knowledge, to be suspicious of it, that's part of the patriarchy. We don't want students to be successful in the world that this knowledge built. There are different knowledges they'll teach them. Mm-hmm. And so, as I just said, we had the sacking of Rome, and what came next? I mean, when they burned down the Library of Alexandria. Now, some parts of it were saved and disseminated throughout the world, but what a tragedy that was. When you lose knowledge, and it can happen so much faster than people think, because it doesn't just live in books. If it doesn't live in us and we don't use it, we are held back. Progress either slows to a crawl or stops. And in some cases, like I'm thinking about people building bridges or maintaining the ones we've got, or flying airplanes, or doing brain surgery, or taking care of our nuclear power plants, or whatever. If you do not have sufficient people with the requisite knowledge to keep your high-tech, knowledge needs civilization going, you have two choices. You go backwards and things decay, or you're relying on robots and machines, which I fear is where they want to take us. The problem is garbage in, garbage out. You still have that tiny little percentage of people who even know how to make that work.
Yeah.
And you've got the equivalent of the modern day, like Visigoths at the gate, or Morlocks, depending on which way, where you want to go with this. But you would think professors would know this and would say, I don't want to live in that world, and I don't want my kids to live in that world, and I don't want my grandkids to live in that world. And maybe I'm just naive or something, but I just wish there were more moral courage, I guess.
No, you're not naive at all. Let's face it, colleges are about being suspicious of knowledge. And by that I mean, how do you interrogate whether something is true? That's what colleges ought to be doing. That's what I'm for, aren't you? What I mean is, when they say they're suspicious of knowledge, they're not being truthful.
No, and they don't let you ask why.
They don't.
And if you ask why, then that's it. That's the end of the conversation, because I said so.
That's right. I am an advocate of being very suspicious of knowledge, and the only way to be really suspicious of knowledge is to make sure the platform is wide open, so that everybody can talk, nobody is shut down, and that the best argument can, if not win, at least make some headway. That's what college is. It's how I changed my mind when I was young. It's how I change my mind now. I try to listen to all sides. Remember what I said earlier. Though I'm an independent, haven't been a big fan of Noam Chomsky over the years. Do I stop reading him? Absolutely not. And I've learned an enormous amount from him. Glenn Greenwald, when he was in an argument with Sam Harris, I was, sort of taking Sam Harris's side way back when they were talking about the threat of Islamic fundamentalism. And I, had a kind of dislike for Glenn Greenwald, I regret to say. As the years have gone on, I've had to, recalibrate. And I realized that Glenn Greenwald all along has been far righter than I realized. And I regard him, even though I don't probably agree with him in some respects, many respects politically. The thing I like about him is that he is interested in pursuing truth. I've never heard him try to shut anybody else down, and he's been an advocate for keeping the conversation going, as has Noam Chomsky. And so that's why I'll talk to anyone who is in favor of more talk, and I'll oppose anyone on either side who's in favor of less talk.
Yes, and I'm at the point now where I will praise someone's integrity even if I disagree with them.
Absolutely.
So if I see that somebody is being, you said, they're being principled and they're making actual arguments, not just logical fallacy after logical fallacy,
yes.
We may arrive at a different conclusion about the same facts, but at least I feel like we're agreeing on what the facts are to start with. And
Absolutely.
That's what I feel like with the woke, and what I'm seeing in schools, or in the ed schools, and then going into our K-12 system, is that we have people telling parents things are that they're claiming things are facts that have absolutely never been established as factual, that cannot be established as factual at all. They're right up there with faith-based statements, affirmations of faith, and they are demanding legal policy to back up their version of reality. So, for example, we now have the Biden administration saying he wants to sign an executive order banning what he calls conversion therapy. But what is actually going to translate to is therapy. So if you have a gender confused child with gender dysphoria, the approved approach is affirmation. And if you take that child, if the child is taken to therapy, the therapist, now, if they are licensed in the state, whatever, they're going to feel this chill that if I do cognitive behavioral therapy, if I do even dialectical behavioral, if I do anything other than affirm this child after 15 minutes in my office, I'm going to get in trouble. We now have the federal government, coming down and saying that. Oh, that's one other thing I meant to say earlier. You said this is all decided at the state level. The federal government has very little say in what goes on in the classrooms.
Yeah.
In theory, except with the money that gets appropriated by Congress for the Federal Department of Education, and especially since COVID, right? So here's the great irony.
Yeah.
We saw what was going on and we were all alarmed and we became active. We were activated as parents and even as some teachers. Then at the same time, billions upon hundreds of billions of dollars went over to the Department of Education. And they are now using that money to bribe states to implement ideological programs like social emotional learning, critical theory, or what they're calling action civics, things of that nature, to turn our kids into little angry activists and neurotics, if you want to know the truth. And that's all federal money. It takes a governor with, I mean, we're talking spine of steel to say, keep your money, I don't want it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
So that's part of how they wield their control.
Yeah, that's a good correction. That's what I was saying earlier. That's certainly the 10% and maybe more so of influence that the government can have, and that's a very dangerous thing. Here again, the gender issue is a confusing one. It's a complex one. I've had a student in the last decade and a half who, from a very early age, thought of herself as a male. I have had many conversations with this person over the years, and I realize that for some people, whether you call it gender dysphoria, whatever you want to call it, it's a real issue. It's a live issue since the time this child was 4. This was way before the wave of this started. So, and I think you probably agreed, Deborah, one wants to be careful on all these issues. My only position is that it has to be discussed openly and carefully. And if you say, for example, that you think that, there should be much more research done, that we should be much more careful in noticing the possible consequences, the deleterious consequences of what's called gender affirmation therapy. If you can't have the conversation without being medicalized by being called a transphobe, that's what I object to, and that's where we have to draw the line. Because again,
and it hurts the rare person like your student. So these people are real, and gender dysphoria is real. I mean, this is a medical condition, but instead of, as you said, researching more, treating this and whatever, it privately outside of the government-run school. I mean, we're putting things in the purview of government that previously were between doctors, patients, it was taken care of in the private realm. And now I think in the spirit of being, accepting and inclusive and welcoming and so forth, there's this push to, let's approach everyone like they might be this, which just statistically is absurd. And it ignores child development because, of course, we know children are children. They're very suggestible, and they like shiny new things, and they want to please the adults around them and so forth. And they want to feel like they're cool. So when you say we have to be careful, we have to be very, very careful what we laud and celebrate and so forth, because everybody wants to, they want to feel special. If you say this is the special thing and this is how to feel special, well, a kid who's feeling confused around puberty, which is pretty much 90% of them, might go with, maybe this is the thing. Maybe this is my thing. And when you see the comorbidities and so forth. So my concern with teachers and ed schools and the education establishment in general, all the way up to the university, is they are coloring outside the lines. They are biting off more than they can chew when they weren't doing a good job in the first place of what their charter was. Like, your job is ostensibly to teach teachers how to teach the academic subjects and manage the classroom so they can learn the academic subjects. And that's your job. You are not pseudo parents. You are not adjunct parents. You are not replacement parents. You are not social workers. You are not psychologists. You are not group therapy leaders. You're not a yoga instructor. You're none of these things. And yet now we have, and you said we need to support teachers more. Yeah, those teachers who are professionals are like, I came here to teach first grade, not to be all these other things. We need to support them and not having being overloaded with all this other stuff. But at the same time, we need to tell the ones who are like eagerly saying, yes, I'd love to spend my day doing yoga instead of teaching reading, and let them know they're in the wrong profession. They should go be a yoga instructor.
Yeah.
And this is This is the problem. I see.
Well, and speaking of teaching reading, it's one of the, I think it's episode 12 or 13 in that series. Basically, I think it's called the reading disaster or something like that. That's a good lesson. The exact wrong way to teach reading has been encouraged at every level for 75 years. Yeah. And the evidence was there. There were plenty of people. Gene Shaw at Harvard, who's written book after book about how to teach reading. And guess what? It turns out that the way your grandmother, your grandfather, your neighbor taught you to read, by sounding out letters, phonics, that's the way to do it.
Yep.
So the education establishment spent 60 years really denying the most basic science that we have, how to teach young children how to read. And that's really not a hard one. That's not a difficult subject. And now we're going to put them in charge of questions of gender reassignment. They have a track record that suggests they should barely be put in charge of counting the number of cookies in a box, much less teaching subjects as complex and as potentially dangerous as gender reassignment.
Well, they also have this publish or perish. If you've got an ed school and an ed grad school, and the academic process, the academic thing, is always be researching, always be writing, always be publishing. And you're talking about something as basic as, teaching a kid how to read, teaching a kid math, whatever. And there really are not that many new ways to do it that you would be doing research. Plus, it's not particularly ethical to research on children. So you're going to be operating in a theoretical space 90% of the time. Anyway, maybe you have anecdotal observations of kids, but you really oughtn't go like experiment for long-term, things. You can document, but you can't like do it. Yeah. Or probably they are doing it, but anyway, but so you get people who are motivated, like the people who put in place this whole word stuff, or the lovely duo out at Stanford University who want to change the way they teach math in California yet again and make it completely absurd. Thankfully, I think it's going to be thrown away, but for personal gain. And people are like, oh, Stanford University. Surely the people with the PhDs, who aren't math PhDs, by the way, they're ed PhDs.
Right. That's right.
Telling all of California, we're talking over 1 million students. Well, I think it's about 1 million students. Yeah. How to learn math? They're not mathematicians. They're not math teachers.
Yes.
This is absurd to me, but this is what we've done. It's like, oh, the educators, so-called, are the experts at a thing that we've known how to do for thousands of years, pretty much. It's not really that new.
No. That's true. That's the monetary aspect of this. This is where, again, my friends on the left should be very alert to this. When you think about, again, I'm not suggesting that the whole language method was designed in order to make money. I don't think you are too either. But the fact is, once you get on that train, the money starts rolling in. I'm not questioning anybody's motives, but I am suggesting that once you get that ball rolling and it begins paying bills, because it does, if you get your textbook, which a lot of the whole language people did, adopted by 1/5 of the public schools in the United States, you're going to be a rich person. And there are so many incentives. Let's be generous and say that they're unconscious. There are so many incentives to simply turn a blind eye to contrary evidence. And that's the problem. There's a lot of money involved, a lot of corporate interests involved. And of course, we're seeing that not only in education, but of course, in the medical community, which, up to 3 years ago, I trusted. I don't much anymore, like many Americans. Regardless of how one feels about the vaccine issue, there have been far too many flip-flops on these issues to take them as seriously as at least I once did.
I think we should go to books like It's Being Done. I think that's the title you said, is It's Being Done?
Yes.
So, okay. And we should be looking at books like that, or the one by Marva Collins, The Marva Collins Way, or even things, John Taylor Gatto and people of that nature. I think we need to go and take this stuff and say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like, why did we start tinkering in the first place? Because as I said, if you come out of World War II and you look at our public schools in the period immediately following there up until we put somebody on the moon, it was like the American public school system was on a roll.
Yeah.
Not perfect, but given how many people it had to educate on public dollars and everything else, it was, rocking and rolling. Like you said, it was the envy of the world, really.
Yeah.
And it's just from 1960 or so on, just went and just nosedived. And then when you add in the Department of Education, forget about it. It was a cliff.
Yeah, and these are accompanied by real declines in test scores, real declines in reading scores. So this isn't just nostalgia talking here. We have had real declines, and it's not simply because as some people will say, oh, that's because we're trying to educate a wider group of people. Sorry, and again, you can read E.D. Hirsch's book Why Knowledge Matters, published in 2015. I trust you. I have no financial interest. I've been promoting this book.
We're like, hello, E.D. Hirsch, you need to pay some royalties to Lyell Asher over
here. Just he's just an astonishing person. I came to too late, but he makes these points, and again, he has wide recognition, of course, among people who study education, but not nearly enough for my money.
So Rin Wisley, thank you so much for the super chat. Thanks for all your hard work, Deb. I'm in California and debating whether I should go into teaching here. What do you say to people who would say, I'm thinking of going into teaching? Are there alternative pathways at this point other than going to these basket case schools? Or do you just say, go find yourself like one of the good ones, or do it some other way, or teach only in a private school? I mean, what would you? Because a lot of the private schools are worse. They're more ideologically captured than the public.
I know. And the fact too, I wouldn't want to discourage anybody who is listening to your program, who clearly, because they're listening to this program, is interested in educating students. I wouldn't want to discourage them from going into teaching, because we need people like that. Right. So, I'm of two minds here. I guess I would encourage this person to be sure and just look up what the regulations are. Talk to somebody and say, what do I have to do in order to teach in a public school? Find out if there are alternative ways. And again, it varies from state to state, and it varies a lot. So that's something to keep in mind. Something tells me California may not be the best place to teach. I'm not sure. I don't know. But I would really do some research on it, and then go to the National Council for Teacher Quality website, and go there and find out, where the good ed schools are. And you can judge that a lot by how they teach reading, which is basically what that site does. It has a list of every state, every ed school in that state. Some of them cooperate, some of them don't, but they have ways of finding out how they teach reading even without their cooperation. And
it's actually pretty easy. A lot of them, you just go to their state board of ed website and look at what they do. But I think while a lot of the private schools are captured, there are isolated parochial schools where they are not under the same, accreditation that is dictating what the rest of the state does. So you can sort of suss out what those are and ask around. You're going to have to do research, but I keep hearing stories from people saying, this isolated school is still sane and they're not using, there are Hillsdale charter schools around. I don't know about California. There are some classical charter schools where, in the states that allow them, where they can still teach a classical curriculum.
That's right.
So it's not impossible. It's just much, much, much more difficult. You have to do a lot of legwork. And I guess the last thing I would suggest as the host of this channel, where I'm obviously a homeschooling proponent, is hang up a shingle. If there's a subject very well, and you feel passionately about it, and you think you could construct a course, and what age range would be good for your course. And maybe it's a pretty wide range. Most people recommend a range of 3 years, but not more. Publish a course, or if you want to have it be synchronous, have a Zoom class. I mean, there are even platforms that allow that, where you can just decide, I'm going to teach, and I know something about this subject, and I'm going to go do it. Being involved in the homeschool community, there are classicists that I've known who started something called Lukion.org. and they teach Latin and Greek and the classics, literature, logic, all of that. And they're in huge demand. Some of the best courses my daughter took online. They're live, they're synchronous classes, but wonderful, wonderful instructors who are absolutely passionate about their subjects. So you can even have access to students who are equally passionate about the subject, right? So if you also, if you're a teacher, something that probably concerns you is, who are my students going to be? And you know that you have got to search your soul. Like, does it matter to you or doesn't it? I found over time, because I still tutor, it does matter to me. I want students who are there because they want to learn. I am not, especially online, which is what I've had to do the last few years. I am not really interested in trying to like pull teeth, you know, and try to pull something out. If they don't want to be there, I'm not the type of person to try to force anybody to do anything. They want to be there. We will have a great class. So you have to think about that too. And that will determine where you teach and so on. But like you, I wouldn't discourage anybody. I just wouldn't say absolutely go fight from within. That's asking a lot. I would never ask that of anyone.
No, it's a difficult subject, and you know, too, Deb, I know you feel this as I do, and I know what it's like to, you know, pull teeth and have people in classes. So, to be honest, very few. I'm blessed with very good students who are for the most part, very interested and lovely people. But you know, that's a different road to hoe when you're in you know, public schools. I worry about, you know, those children, as you do, I'm sure, who won't have the interests, not because of themselves, but just because of the way they're raised, the opportunities they don't have. So, you know, I don't know how we reach those kids. I don't know how we reach those families. That's the most difficult and depressing subject of all. But we do have to help educate the ones who are there, whose families, regardless of their income levels or anything else, want a good education for their children. And again, you know, that comes from people, as you know, all races, all backgrounds, all economic classes.
Absolutely. Yeah. What I'm hoping to do is see more entrepreneurs start up a little, whether it's micro schools or smaller, just alternatives to what's going on right now, where they're willing to operate outside the government accreditation system and so on. And a lot of parents I'm already hearing saying, you know, you can't do worse, you know, that kind of thing. Then have it set up such that, you know, you don't offer lunch and you don't offer sports, and you know, it's more just the academics, the basics. And you can get some of those teachers who don't want to be in the public system anymore and charge tuition that's a far cry less than the NAIS schools, but pull a fund for scholarships for those kids who couldn't otherwise pay. And, you know, tell people like, you can pay this much or you can pay 10% more and add to the fund so other kids can come. And I actually think that would take off, and you would be able to fund some students who could go, you know, who wouldn't otherwise have been able to be there, and have little community schools. I think, and I'm not talking community schools, the state version. I'm talking the little schoolhouse. You know, like I feel like we need to bring that back and restore some passion for learning and just get back to the basics. Because I think when you talk about the most toxic ideology that I see in the schools today is, it doesn't have a specific name. I mean, you could call it critical theory, whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. But it's really just the pervasive negative view of the future, fear of the future, whatever you would label that as, where students are coming in, especially those coming from, you know, areas where they're impoverished or so forth, they have one parent, or, you know, things are not so great at home. I've told people, your job as a teacher is, you are hope. Your job is hope, not hope of the candy coated, sugary kind, hope of like, let's learn things. Let's learn. I'm going to give you skills. I'm going to give you knowledge. I'm going to give you power to change your life as an individual. You're not responsible for the world. You're not responsible to fix the whole town or the whole city. But you, as you said earlier, you can change your life with this knowledge and applying your effort. And I think, you know, if we could restore that type of philosophy to education, that yes, it is liberating when you give them knowledge, not anger, not emotions, then it would be not toxic. It would be wonderful. It would be nurturing. Right now, it's not nurturing. It's toxic to hope.
Yeah, and this is accomplished through a variety of means. One of which is the selective reading of history. There are lots of selective readings. You can have a selective reading that tells you only the good things about your nation,
Right.
and we've had that in the past, no question. But now we're basically giving a selective reading of only the bad things. The truth is, you can make
Right.
up any narrative you want. Um,
Right.
but a balanced narrative will talk about all sides of the issue. We want to talk
Yep.
about the terrible things that the nation has done, but we also want to point out, I mean, this is, you see this in college classrooms as well. And I think I mentioned this in the video. Um, the issue of slavery, students, for the most part, have no clue that that slavery is a worldwide phenomenon, going back as
Mm-hmm.
far as recorded history as one could care to go.
Mm-hmm.
And this, again, is not to legitimize slavery, of course not, but it is to point out that there was nothing unusual, particularly, about the slave trade or slavery. It's been going on for as long as anyone can remember. If you know anything about the Incas, you know anything about the Aztecs, you know anything about the people that are now occupying the island of Japan and China, India, wherever you choose to go, Sudan, Africa, the Arab states, slavery was a given. And it was a given right up through the 20th century, by the way, and even
Right.
into the 21st. So the
Exactly.
issue is not whether we talk about the good to the exclusion of the bad, it's whether we talk about the bad to the exclusion of the good. We want all these students to realize just how complex and nuanced the world is. If you don't do that, it's really like giving people negative therapy. It's like if you took somebody and said, let me just remind you of all the terrible things you've done.
Right.
And never mention the fact that other people have done similar things, that you're not alone in your flaws, that you're not alone in your
Right.
mistakes. If you did that to a human being, you'd say this is child abuse. So when you
That's
do
right.
that about a nation to children, it's another form of abuse. When you tell them
I
that they are
agree.
guilty for other people's sins, that they themselves are
Mm-hmm.
already, they come into this world guilty. It sounds a lot like, a kind of fundamentalist Christianity that I thought we were supposed to reject.
Well, and
Um,
the other thing is that I think there's an age appropriate time to present the negative. So
yes,
I don't see anything wrong whatsoever when you're trying to build a common culture and a common narrative. So, a baseline from which to explore the truth in greater depth as the child's brain develops and is capable of reason and is capable of
sure.
analysis. But initially, if you're going to put sort of a narrative in there, it's all you can give a kid up to the age of 10, really, then it
Yes,
ought to be the positive one. It ought to be the one that says, I live in a basically good place where good people tried to do a good thing. And on balance, we are a good place to be and we do good things in the
yes,
world. And then as they get older, you can say, well, to balance out, even good people, because this is true of people too, even good countries have made mistakes and done some very bad things. Then you can talk about it. I mean, I learned about slavery in fourth grade. I wrote a paper on the Civil War, but it was like as a fact. It
yes,
was like, and they owned slaves. I was at even in fourth grade, I thought that's terrible. And I remember because I
yes.
was growing up in the Northeast, I was like, I'm glad I was on the winning side. Like as a little kid, I was like, I'm really glad I was on the good guy side. It was kind of how I felt about
Yes,
it.
right,
But
sure.
but it was a primitive little, 9-year-old's thought. And moving on, it's like I know what the Civil War is, when it happened, what it was about, blah, 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 moving on. And then, of course, we learned about a little more depth again in like seventh grade and a little more depth in 10th grade. And by the time I got to college, I could have really deep discussions about the Civil War because we had touched on it multiple times at different levels of depth. I feel like today's educators think they have to get it all done in kindergarten. It was like, or we have to get it all done. And that first time we ever mention, American history, we got to
Yes,
dump it all on this kid. And that's not appropriate.
yeah. No, I agree. I remember in the third grade, I can still see it. I know it's the third grade because I remember the teacher and I remember the board. We were talking about the dark and bloody land of Kentucky where I was in school. And it was this hunting territory, and it was very clear, and it was made apparent that this land didn't belong to us. that there were people here before us. So we all kind of recognized this was not shoved under the rug and said, we kind of took it. And
Right.
So this was not, there was no way to explain this except that we kind of stole their land. So, the idea somehow that we've been, that all these things have just been, set aside. To be sure, we probably could have done a little better job. But as you point out, if you give students just the downbeat version of not only the past but their own personal past,
Right.
I can only see that going in one direction. It only goes
Yeah.
in the direction, I think I saw someone say in the chat, nihilism.
Yeah.
You get them to the point where they have no motive to do better. The early Christians knew this. When we talk about, I say early Christian, medieval Christianity, we'd always talk, I would tell my students about this. We always think about pride being the sin. The medieval Christians and the Renaissance Christians knew something else. They knew that despair was the darkest of all sins, because you, first of all, doubted the power of God. I'm not a believer myself, but I will say this, that we could convert it into secular terms. Once you go into despair in this way, you doubt the possibility of a future.
That's correct.
And so there is, I think you're exactly right. If you're going to err on the side of something, please err on the side of hope, of goodness, of love.
Exactly. I totally agree. Is there anything to wrap up that you'd like to say to the audience about any of this, or any last words of wisdom you'd like to give us about school, about university, any of it at all? I do urge everyone to please go watch that series of videos. It's fantastic. All right, you can go to
There's a new cut, by the way, of that
YouTube
video that Peter just put out. I think it's they've cut out some of the transitions basically, and it's cleaned up a couple of one of the graphics got kind of distorted when we moved it around. Anyway, so the newest version of it came out, I think on April 10th, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
And it's getting, a lot of views, not for YouTube. I mean, YouTube, anything under 1 million views is small. But anyway, it's there. And I would also be happy to answer anybody's questions. If you can, you can email me at either my school email address, asher@lclark.edu, which is readily available. And I'd be happy to talk with anyone, recommend books, articles, ideas. I'd be happy to do that. So, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And Jeff, thank you so much for the super chat. Lyell, this was great. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I learned a lot, and I feel like we covered the topic. I mean, I think most of my audience know what's going on in the K-12 school, but the part that was missing is connecting the dots of how it gets there from above.
Yes.
And the ed school piece is the missing link. So yeah. I'm very glad that you came and explained it to us. And folks, if you go watch the series, you will understand it in a much greater depth, how this whole business with the administrators and the ed schools and all that, it is really the crux of the problem.
Yeah.
And that is why I tell people, like, you can go change your school board, but you've still got the pipeline to concern yourself with.
Yeah, it's a big job, but I'm hopeful.
I'm hopeful too. Always, hope springs eternal. Well,
Yes.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Lyell. Have a great rest of your afternoon. I'll see you all later.
Thanks, Deb. Great talking to you.